Hello and welcome to the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub first webinar for 2025 as part of the Food System Solution webinar series. My name is Abigail Smith. I'm a team member at the Hub. And as everybody comes in and settles into the room, I'm just going to walk you through a few different housekeeping notes. First of all, today's session is being recorded and it will be available online on YouTube after this, and we will be sharing it with everybody. I'll share the data disclaimer in the chat. We've also enabled the chat function for today. You can use this to say hello, introduce yourself, and react to what the panelists are saying. For the question and answer portion of today's segment happening towards the end, we ask that you use the Q&A button, which you'll find on the bottom of your chat screen. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions and concerns, and if we don't, we'll do our best to follow up with you following the webinar. Finally, we ask that you rename yourself to include your country and organization first, so we can easily identify who we have in the room. We have a lot of great speakers today, so I don't want to take up too much time. So we'd like to kick today's session off by handing the floor to Stefanos Fotou, the director of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Thank you.
Abigail, thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on which time zone you are connecting from. I'm very pleased to start this first webinar that we do as part of the UN Food System Solutions webinar. And I would like to say that I'm very pleased that we start with such a theme on the foresight, and I will try in the next 5 minutes to explain why I think it's extremely important. We are living today in a world that we have very conflicting messages when it comes to our achievements and to our performance with the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of information we have, all the data we have, they told us that we are nowhere to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And we need a very strong acceleration. We are already 10 years into the 2030 Agenda. We have only 5 years more. And we are increasingly facing an uncertain future. We don't know exactly what our future is going to be. We have a number of factors that they contribute to geopolitical instability. We have issues with the humanitarian work, with the development work, even issues with peace. And it's really very difficult to understand what our future is going to be. One of the fundamental functions that the United Nations system has is to provide evidence for policymaking. And especially today, where we are in an environment that evidence-based decisions, unfortunately, are substituted by perspective-based decisions, it's more and more important to put science and evidence behind any decision-making. And it is very important to use even methods of the science that they go beyond what we know so far when it comes to ways that we can not predict, I would not say predict, but to imagine what the future should be. So the positioning of foresight into our efforts to support sustainable food system transformations is extremely central. Because with the foresight, we try to imagine and we try to describe alternative futures. And I think the power of foresight is that it's doing this in a very stakeholder-oriented and inclusive and interdisciplinary way. And that's what makes it different from some quantitative methods that we have used in order to predict some quantitative outcomes in the future. So we do really need to focus more on how we present to the policymakers, how we present to the stakeholders these alternative futures, or at least methodologies and ways that these alternative futures could be perceived and could be studied in our efforts to have new policies or implement or enforce policies for the achievement of sustainable development goals. So let me close with going a little to my Greek origin. You know that the Greeks have a tendency to say that they have invented everything. And we do have a tendency actually to say that we have invented foresight. And if you Google the name the Cassandra oracle, you will see that it was a person from the ancient Greek mythology that had the power of foresight. The god Apollo has given her the god of the power of foresight. And what we know is that whatever she has foreseen happened. But, the gods are not fair. The god Apollo gave her the power of foresight, but at the same time, he cursed her that nobody should believe her. And she was a kind of person that she could foresee everything, but nobody was taking any action on what she was taking. But today, foresight is not a thing coming from an oracle. Foresight is something that's coming from science. And that's why we have every condition that we need really to build up on what foresight tells us and really try to use it for better policy making and the acceleration of food system transformation pathways. So I'm very pleased that in this first webinar today, setting the scene and keynote address will come from a very good colleague, Jim Woodhill. Jim has a number of affiliations. He's a senior consultant in the Environment Change Institute at the University of Oxford. He's the director of Agri-Food Systems and Futures Hub in the University of Reading, but especially he is the lead of the Foresight for Food initiative, and he's leading global efforts on using foresight for the acceleration of the food system transformation towards the achievement of the SDGs. So I'm very pleased to invite Jim to give us a setting the scene and keynote presentation. After this, my colleague Mia will facilitate the webinar. Jim, the floor is to you.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephanos. Great to be with everybody. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending what part of the world you're in. You'll hear my Australian accent, so I can't claim the sort of fame that Stephanos came to this sort of deep, long history of thinking. But anyway, let me just share with you a few basic ideas around what we mean by foresight, scenarios, and futures thinking. And let me share my screen here. Right, I think we have that working, correct?
No, Jim, I'm sorry, I don't see your screen.
You don't see my screen. Okay, what's happening here?
There we are, but not full screen yet.
Okay. Now that's working. Okay, good. Sorry about that.
All good.
Okay, so as Stephanos said, I mean, we really still have enormous challenges in trying to transform food systems to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and longer-term sustainable development. Just a little bit of background. Foresight for Food is a global network. It includes FAO, the CG, a whole range of different research institutions, practitioners in foresight, who are all interested in trying to apply the thinking, the methodologies, the practice of foresight and scenario work to the challenges of changing food systems. So foresight and futures thinking. I mean, what do we really mean by this? So Stephanos has just mentioned, we're obviously dealing with incredibly turbulent times. I mean, we've seen what's happened with markets and the funding for the aid sector. We've seen the impact of COVID, the war in Ukraine, all having big impacts on the food system. And clearly, as we move into the future, accelerated by the impact of climate change, we are going to be dealing with an increasingly turbulent world. That brings with us a huge amount of uncertainty, and also brings with it a lot of ambiguity and different stories from different stakeholders about how they think they should deal with these issues. And that, of course, gives us a whole set of systemic risks. But we also need to be thinking about what are some of the transformational opportunities. And essentially, the only way we can deal with these big systemic risks we're facing is by looking for some of the opportunities for doing things differently. So this is really the point of foresight, to help us get a better understanding of future risks and the sort of opportunities for bringing a more desirable future into play. So I think there's sort of four things that are really important in terms of foresight and futures thinking. The first one is using foresight to basically explore what the future might be like. basically asking the question, what would happen if? The second one then is to assess as carefully as we can some of the future risks and opportunities in different future scenarios, which is a really important foundation for resilience. We want to be then engaging stakeholders in envisaging what would be more desirable alternative futures. So by developing scenarios, we can get actors in the food system to say, well, actually, we don't want to end up over there. We'd prefer to end up there. And then that can help to unlock the thinking about what sort of pathways for change do we need, which is then the final point. How can we use foresight and scenario thinking to really look at some of the options for nudging systems in more desirable directions? What are some of the processes of systemic change we need? And of course, recognizing we can't control the world, we can't engineer it, but it's much more of a whole learning process about how to take us into the future in more desirable rather than less desirable ways. So you'll come across the idea of scenario thinking a lot in the whole foresight and futures thinking, which quite simply is just saying, if we look maybe towards 2050, what different scenarios could we imagine for how our food systems might look, whether it's at a local level, a national level, or globally? And to do that, we basically say, what are some of the clear trends that we think will shape the future? And then we also can look at what do we think are some of the big uncertainties that could lead to very different futures. So we then do some of our analysis, data gathering to try and get a better understanding about these different trends and these different uncertainties to help us to develop different scenarios. A slightly simpler way, perhaps, of explaining this is the crocodile in the river here, and you can see a couple of ducks swimming down the river, and one saying, shouldn't we stop to consider our options? The other one looking backwards and sort of saying, why bother? Everything just seems fine. And of course, you can see the crocodile down there. So essentially, foresight is thinking about the future to improve decision making today. And scenarios are being prepared for and creating alternative futures. So in this little picture, you can see, one scenario is they perhaps end up as crocodile lunch, or maybe they have a lucky escape just close to the riverbank. Maybe they have a smooth ride down a different path of the river, or perhaps end up in an unseen dead end. The important thing to look at in this is the decision point. If you look a bit further into the head and you consider all of these different factors, you have a much bigger range of decisions and options that you can consider. And in this situation, you might even be far more creative and decide that the solution is to fly away. So let me come back to the point that Stefanos mentioned about really struggling to make some of the progress on the SDGs that we need to, and us all being very aware that food systems really lie at the heart of many of the challenges of achieving the SDGs. And in thinking about how we make progress, I find it very useful to think about the why of change, the what of change, and the how of change. And if we want an organization or an individual or a society to change, we have to have the why, the what, and the how. And so if we think about food systems transformation, I think we've got very clear about the why. Why do we need to change food systems in terms of impacts on climate, health, equity, poverty, hunger, etc.? That story has been told loud and clear many times. And we've also started to develop a pretty clear understanding of what might be some better directions to go, all sorts of targets in the SDGs, national food systems transformation pathways have all sorts of targets and more desirable things they'd like to achieve. But I think where we're really struggling is with the how. How do we actually make this change happen? Which has got a lot to do with the messy process of how people interact, communicate, engage, political will, stakeholder dialogue, building alliances, all of this sort of stuff. And so the argument I would like to make is that foresight can be a very useful and powerful tool in helping to engage with the whole transformation process. So hence this whole idea about using foresight to help drive change. And so we need to think much more carefully, I would suggest, around what are the processes that can bring science together with stakeholder processes, with policy to really help shape the sort of futures we would like. So from the Foresight for Food perspective, we've developed a very simple guiding framework to help use foresight in the context of food systems change, which is really saying, why are we going to do this? Mapping the system, understanding the food system, exploring different futures, and then mobilizing for systems change. And in that, really emphasizing the importance of the evidence base and emphasizing the importance of bringing together stakeholder participation with the evidence base. And Lorenzo will talk to us in a moment about how FAO has been doing a whole lot of work around getting the evidence base around the drivers and triggers of transformation. And I think it's important to think about institutionally embedding foresight in our research institutions, in our policy processes, in our government agencies. There's a whole series of different tools that you can link into the foresight process. I'm not going to go through any of these, and we'll shortly be having a whole guide that will come out on the different sorts of tools you can use. We found it very useful to use an overall framing of the key elements of a food system, and a starting point for doing the foresight work is to really explore what's happening with the outcomes of our food system, what's actually going on in the activities in our food system, what are the big institutional factors that are influencing how the food systems works, that's influencing behavior, and what are some of the big drivers. And so starting to map all of this stuff out is a starting point of doing your foresight work and helping stakeholders to understand what we actually mean by a food system and the important relationships in a food system. Here you can see a whole bunch of different scenarios that were developed for our work in Bangladesh, where we looked at some of the big future uncertainties around diets, environment, corporatization, whether small and medium scale enterprises were going to have opportunities in the future, climate, trade, and equity. And thinking about these different uncertainties led to these 4 different scenarios. I won't talk them through in detail, but you can see the obvious one about hazardous consequences. You can see the one about 2 sides of a coin, where you have huge amounts of inequality in the way the food system is working. And this sort of visualization can really help people to understand what are some of the direct implications for them of different pathways into the future and what would be more or less desirable ways of going. This one's maybe a little bit too long, but I think it is really useful to think about basically behavior. If we're thinking about the right processes for food systems transformation, we have to be basically thinking about how do we shift the behavior, whether it's of citizens and consumers, politics and government, business and markets. And so how can we use our foresight thinking to understand the different sort of incentives? Now, whether it's our cultural incentives, economic ones, regulatory ones, or even coercive ones. And can we use foresight processes to help unlock some of the lock-ins that come from different groups having power, with different structures being in place? And how do we think about embedding foresight into new alliances, new ways of leadership, different sorts of civic action, the way we use media, informed dialogue, getting the right narrative about the future? So I think when we're talking foresight and scenarios, it's about really getting into the depth of how we understand change and how we understand some of the different incentives that will drive different forms of behavior. There's a whole set of thinking around conditions for systems change. I'll just show this slide here just to alert you to that, but it really emphasizes some of the thinking about going deep in terms of mental models are influencing change, and as I've mentioned, engaging with some of the issues around power dynamics and relationships. So just to wrap up here, on one side, I'd like to say that we have the direct role of foresight, which is really exploring what the future is like, assessing risks and opportunities, engaging stakeholders and thinking about better futures, and really looking at the ways forward. But there's a whole bunch of more indirect benefits that can come from using foresight, which is around creating the shared awareness and understanding we need, informing decision-making, establishing trust between different actors in the system, helping to mobilize different alliances, helping to shift mindsets. So I think it's very useful to think about the direct methodological approach of foresight and scenarios, but also many of these indirect benefits that are really the foundation of being able to bring change. I think there's also two levels of foresight thinking. One is about getting the really big picture of envisaging the future, whether that's asking what sort of food system we would like at a national level or a global level or at a local level. And the other one is using foresight and scenario thinking for going much deeper when we want to think about different options for how to achieve desirable futures. So in a particular country, if we want to have fresh fruit and vegetables playing a much more important role in diets, what are the different scenarios for how that could actually be achieved?
Jim,
finally,
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up. Okay, thanks.
This is my last slide. We had a very good meeting with the UN Food Systems Hub in January, and the report from that's now out on the Foresight for Food website. So thank you very much. I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about.
Thanks a lot, Jim, for this insightful keynote presentation. And hello, everyone. My name is Mia Madsen, and I'm working as a policy officer at the Food Systems Coordination Hub. And I'll be facilitating this discussion today. So we are now going to hear from a panel of speakers who will be sharing insights from ongoing foresight initiatives around the world. It's my pleasure to introduce Lorenzo Giovanni Bellu, who's a senior economist and lead of the Policy Intelligence Branch Global Perspectives of FAO. Lorenzo, I have a question for you. Can you please tell us how methods for and findings from FAO strategic foresight work are being used to shape the actions of a global organization like FAO? The floor is yours.
So thanks a lot for the question. I apologize for the voice is not at the top, but I will hope to do. I will do my best. So Mia, the question is quite comprehensive, but I will try to highlight the way we use strategic foresight within the organization. So just to say why strategic, because we want to fill the gap between the why and the what that Jim just highlighted, how to transform, and strategic because we want to identify strategic behaviors. We want to strategize the way we act in order to achieve this transformation. So it's not foresight whatever, it's foresight for decision making. And the first users of our findings is ourselves, the organization as such. And then the next users are our member countries, the members of FAO. Just to, if you allow me to show a couple of slides, just to give you simple examples of what I mean when I say that. I hope that you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can see.
So essentially, we are very much engaged in the transformation of agri-food systems, and we look into a future of transformed agri-food systems. But as Jim said, we need to fill this gap between the reasons why we want to transform that are somehow well known, and the type of transformation that we want to achieve, which is a future of sustainable and resilient and inclusive agri-food systems. And Jim already mentioned the fact that there are some driving forces that determine the past, the present, and the future of agri-food systems. Well, we started investigating these driving forces for what? For detecting what in future science are called weak signals of possible futures. And I give you immediately an example. Stay with me and look at the graph on the left-hand side.
Lorenzo, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We can see your speaker view. Can you please go full screen for us? Thank you.
Maybe now?
They're perfect now. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, this is the GDP per capita. Well, nothing related to the future because the graph goes from 1990 to 2023. But we learn a lot about the future by looking back into the past because we're interested in causal relationships among these driving forces? Well, what you observe there, considering that the yellow line is GDP per capita in high-income countries, the red line is GDP per capita in sub-Saharan Africa, and all the other lines are per capita GDP in other geographic zones of low and middle income countries. Well, you don't need to be an economist to understand that GDP per capita in high-income countries keeps growing, while in sub-Saharan Africa doesn't grow at all. Okay, what is the signal that you get out of that? Simple as it is, a future of divergence between some parts and some low and middle income countries and the income countries has not to be ruled out. I would say, is most likely, unless you revert the forces that determine these trends. If you look at the second graph is cost and affordability of healthy diets. Again, people unable to afford healthy diets on the vertical axis, cost of healthy diets on the horizontal axis. The red line on the top, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of people not able to afford healthy diets, with the cost of healthy diet increasing from 2017 to 2022. While you see high-income countries on the other side of the picture. So again, this is an outcome. The signal about the future is that a future where everybody have access to a healthy diet is by far not reached yet. And if we want to achieve this future, we need a lot of transformative actions and efforts. Well, this is just an example. I don't want to bother you because if you want, you're interested in the drivers of agri-food systems, you can have a look to this report of FAO, drivers and triggers for transformation. But this is just to say that based on these findings, FAO determined 4 triggers for transformation, 4 areas that deserve particular attention. One is governance at all levels. The second one is consumer awareness, consumers as an engine of transformation. A third one is income and wealth distribution, and it goes without saying, looking at these graphs. And the fourth one is technologies and innovations, how to do things in a better way in order to reverse some of the ongoing processes. I just conclude saying that all this fed into the work of the organization, and in particular, in the strategic framework, the reviewed strategic framework of the organization, which is going to be discussed and approved in the next conference in June 2025. I just quote some findings that fed into the strategic framework. Strengthening multilateral institutions, particularly important these days as a recommendation. Establishing trade policies that protect virtuous countries from unduly unfair competition from countries that adopt more lax standards. Harnessing the consumer's environmental and health consciousness to drive dynamic changes into production systems. Addressing information asymmetries along value chains to retain more value added in low and middle income countries in value chains, and addressing power dynamics and asymmetries. All this is now in the strategic framework of the organization, thanks to the strategic foresight work that we carried out within the organization to the service of members of our member countries. I stop here. If you want to stay tuned on these findings and the next steps, you have these references in the slide, and this will be also with you together with the material of the webinar. So thanks, and back to Mia.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo, for sharing these reflections. And the PowerPoints will be shared with the participants after the meeting. So you will have the possibility to look more into depth here. We have a limited time, only half an hour left, and we have a number of panelists that are speaking. So I'll move on to our next speaker, which is Nevena Alexandrova Stefanova, Innovation Officer at FAO Office of Innovation. Nevena, I have a question for you. How does FAO use Foresight for policy development and innovation? Over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. This is exactly what I'm going to respond during my very short presentation. I'm going to talk about how we use Foresight to innovate in policies through a process that we call Innovation Policy Labs. I hope you can see my slides. And okay, so the Office of Innovation is all the offices in FAO, is a cross-cutting a structure that has 3 primary goals. One is to try to help close the science, technology, and innovation gap, while bringing inclusivity, so caring for the most vulnerable people, smallholders, women, youth, and elderly. And at the same time, pairing the right type of innovation with the right levels of transformation. So we have the 4R mantra in the Office of Innovation: right innovation, right time, right impact, and the right place. So Foresight actually plays a central role in fulfilling this mandate. And as you can see, Foresight is part of the Office of Innovation model of anticipating change and planning ahead. And what we actually do, we provide with thematic reports, such as on technologies and innovations, on rethinking extension and advisory services, on agroecology. We currently work together with another division on women empowerment in innovation. And we also provide tools for capacity development for FAO and also for our member states. And this is a tool that we work on to contextualize different Foresight methodologies according to the transformation you want to achieve, with the idea to accelerate the transformative innovation processes, but building also consensus, improving the system level governance and management, and of course, plan long term. We use various methods to do so. And this is also recognized by the Office of Innovation with our flagship initiative that we call Future Food iLab, I standing from innovation, where all the reports that we provide systematically are a part of the Foresight Observatory. Foresight Academy is the capacity development activities. Of course, we do collective intelligence together with partners through our partnership program. And what is even more important is how we put all the global and regional reports or country reports into practice to transform policies that can be contextual or broader for transforming agri-food systems. These are 2 recent reports that we published. And interestingly, the Innovation Policy Labs, the contextualizing component of the Future Food Labs, appears to be one of the most demanded innovation across the responses of our experts and stakeholders. Response to multiple challenges. We studied different challenges and the response of technologies and innovations, for instance, for climate change, for inclusivity, and many others. And this is what you see as the response of multiple challenges. So what innovation policy labs are? These are multi-stakeholder partnerships where policies are formulated and implemented at the same place, following the usual, I would say, policy process related to data collection and analysis, formulation, implementation, and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. However, we use UN 2.0 capabilities. These are foresight, behavioral science, data, digital, and innovation in order to transform those policies through processes like deconstruction, reframing, and co-creation. So we are currently working in several countries, Tunisia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Liberia, and Colombia, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Uzbekistan, and we are starting our work in Kenya, Senegal, and Zimbabwe soon. These are just a few examples of transformative processes that we have achieved. This example comes from Azerbaijan, where we had the task through a project to prepare first ever agriculture advisory services strategy. In this context, private sector services were not popular. There was a project after the collapse of the Soviet Union with the World Bank that tried to establish private services. And after 10 years of project duration, the private services collapsed totally. The other challenge that we faced was that there was this belief that smallholders should not be served by advisory services. But the reality in Azerbaijan was that from a total 2 million farmers, 1,600,000 were smallholders. So there was a no-go. And then what we do, we use the foresight scenarios in order to build consensus and get insights. What we got was during a backcasting exercise that the most undesirable scenario was not a very negative scenario of Third World War, but actually a scenario in which we have the division of rich and poor farmers. Business class are those farmers that are big and can pay for services, and all the rest cannot be served. This was an eye-opener for the stakeholders. So they said, we do want to have a policy pillar that is about access to services for all. So this is how this was used as an avenue to bring women, youth, and elderly as well on board.
Nevena, I kindly ask you to wrap up because we are short on time.
We also use this in Uzbekistan for a regional strategy for innovation services. And also in Liberia, at the end of the process for validation, for midway in Madagascar for supporting farmers, and also in the beginning of the process in Kazakhstan to reform and plan a training for long term. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing these examples with us, Nevena. I would like to take the opportunity to ask participants who have any questions to post them in the chat if you would like to reach out to a certain speaker. That will save us some time. We'll move to the next speaker, who is Miss Wangechi Gitata Kiriga, Foresight for Food, Kenya country facilitator. Could you please share with us how you have used the Foresight tools in Kenya at the Nakuru County level? Over to you, Wangechi.
Thank you. Thank you, Mia. Just to also mention that, yes, your question is regarding Nakuru County. And for those who are listening, Kenya is split into 47 counties. We're piloting in 2, Nakuru County, which is in the Rift Valley and is sometimes referred to as a high potential county, just because of the population, its geography, and what comes out of it. And then we're also doing some work in the northern part of the country, which is also famous for being the cradle of mankind, and that's in Turkana County, home to the largest freshwater lake in the Rift Valley. But more importantly, it's a completely different geographic area when it comes to food systems, because that one focuses is mainly a semi-arid and an arid land. But we've seen how Foresight has been used in these very different contexts and scenarios. I'm going to just share a couple of slides, and Jim is going to help me walk through that. And as we do that, just to also reference the fact that Foresight is working in 4 countries. We're in Kenya, we're in Uganda, we're in Bangladesh, and we're also in the Jordan. So it's really exciting to see how these tools and processes can be used across different geographies, as well as completely different contexts. And bringing in Foresight for Food in Kenya, one of the things that we really did in Nakuru, going back to what Jim talked about, is really just to bring stakeholders together. And the main idea with all of this is to make sure that all stakeholders, we have a phrase we like to use, all of government and all of society, is included in part and parcel of that process, because that's the only way that you can leverage and bring about that behavior change that has been mentioned by all the previous speakers. And we did this by bringing in stakeholders from private sector. And I also like to include farmers in private sector, because sometimes what had been mentioned by the previous speaker is that the larger agribusinesses, the larger commercial farms are the ones that are talked of when you speak of private sector. But farmers, even if they're smallholder farmers, are also private sector, because they're not, it's not government, it's individuals who have chosen to be in the business of farming, because it can only be in the business of it that you get this transformation that we're looking for. So we had all of that. We had non-governmental organizations, we had government at all levels, subnational and also national, coming in, and financiers, etc. So we had a whole process that we've been using through the different workshops and meetings that we've been having. But one of the biggest things that came out of this was the fact that farmers and policymakers were in the same room, that we had financiers also in the same room, and everybody was coming in together to build what they saw as the future for Nakuru's food system. In Kenya, there's a lot of work that is at subnational level. And so, yes, you've got the policy being driven at national level, but implementation happens at the county level. So it was really important that if transformation is going to happen at grassroots, that grassroots are also included in these discussions. So we use different tools. And if we go into the next one, and Foresight has several. And one of the things that is one of my favorites is really looking at these scenarios and having all these different people come in together to look at how these critical uncertainties, and we've listed them here, and to just give you a snapshot of how these were taken in, and plus the evidence and the data, the trends that were already there, how those were coming together and gave these different people an opportunity to see, if they map these together, what kind of futures could there be in Nakuru. And you have some of these different ones around an equitable and sustainable opportunity, but versus something where you've got corporate capture, which a lot of the stakeholders felt is where we currently are in Nakuru County, where we've got really big farms consolidating agriculture with a very big focus on export markets. As some of you may know, Kenya happens to be a huge exporter of flowers and horticultural products, especially to the European market. So that was seen as, by some, as a lot of the stakeholders, as part of that corporate capture. But what that also meant was that again, we heard from even from Lorenzo's presentation that consumers have an important role to play, and where markets are will drive behavior in value chains and food systems. And so we find that some of these things are the ones that the market pushes down and forces certain policies and economic changes. And it was really good to have all these different players in the room coming up with these different things. I cannot fail to mention that we also did some work in Turkana and Marsabit counties, and this was in conjunction with the World Food Programme. And here we were looking at how can we use Foresight processes to unlock the potential of Lake Turkana. And I'm happy to see that some of these things are being shared online. But part of the reason why it was really important to have a participatory process in Lake Turkana was because we wanted to do things differently. That's also a region of the country that is known for these white elephant projects, where and it's also a very fragile context, not only in terms of security, actual physical security, but also in terms of food security as well. And so things needed to be done differently, and part of it was really making sure that all the community feels that they are part and parcel of the process, and also part and parcel of the solutions. So we use rich pictures, and that really got a lot of people going. It was great because you don't need complex language to draw and to express yourself. And so we did foresight and backcasting and trends and uncertainties, and we used Kiswahili, which is our national language. We used English. We also used the local languages there, but everybody can draw. And that way, everybody had a chance to say something and to also give their inputs. So we used a lot of historic knowledge. We used data walks. We brought all of those things together, and we asked people for their lived experience. And having that expressed in these different ways was also very refreshing for them, because it wasn't expertise coming from, being jetted in from different parts of the world or even the country, but it was the people of Lake Turkana themselves saying, this is what we've seen. These are the trends that we have seen over the last 30 years. And therefore, this is what we think is going to happen in the future. And being able to contextualize that and bring it back to the stakeholders and have them reflect on what it is that we had heard from them, I think was really, really important. And so we're looking forward to this work and how this is going to be used to implement this program. It's a 10-year program, and this was just the first phase of it. And we're really excited about it. In Nakuru County, as I wrap up, Mia, we have a lot of work that we're doing with policymakers. And even just last week, we've had a national level dialogue with policymakers in Kenya, looking at how we're going to be implementing how we're working towards implementing and actualizing these future scenarios together. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you a lot, Vangechi, for sharing this experience with us. Okay, so I'm handing over now to Miss Emily Sharp, Director, Strategy, Performance and Learning from the Pacific Community. Emily, the question for you is, could you share with us the example of a participatory foresight process in the Pacific Community? You have a lot of experience from that. Over to you, Emily.
Well, Vanaka, everybody, very big gratitude to Director Stefanos and FAO for the opportunity. I might just start the story about where is the Pacific and who are we talking about. So the organization I work with has the great privilege of working with the 22 Pacific Island countries and territories of the Pacific. Such a very big ocean state, 12 million people, 1,400 languages, 28 million square kilometers, and about 20% of the global EEZs. If you have eaten tuna in the last week, potentially it has come from the Pacific Ocean, as we actually export and provide about 50 to 60% of the world's tuna stocks. why is all of that really important? Because our food system has a very big blue part to it, which is really important then when we're thinking about how to envision current and future food systems, is to really involve people who are living in the context. And that brings me to the who bit, the what, the why, the where, and the who. So we've been using participatory food systems, foresight and futures methods to really help us unpack the food system for the Pacific, our current state, what's making up our experiences in terms of drivers of change. You can see here is a bit of a picture of that. But really, for the whole point is to help us co-create policies and frameworks to support decision-making that is also intergenerational. It's thinking about what is the food system that's going to sustain us into the future. So the who then brings me to this slide, and this is a fantastic one from my colleague Alisi Tungo, our food systems coordinator, who just started mapping out some of the actors and the players in the food system in the Pacific. And we come to this who because food systems and foresight futures enable us to really test our assumptions and really test our blind spots. And often when we have been creating policies in the past, not just for food systems, but for many different sectors and thematics, we can do so with a very governmental lens. And sometimes, you know, engaging, consulting after drafts have been written with civil society and private sector, but Foresight and Futures enables us to engage people really early on. So we've got an example here of where we've been working in the agriculture and forestry sector. I mean, obviously our food system has coastal, aquaculture, oceanic, agriculture, forestry, very big health issue sector because of the non-communicable diseases. But when we start bringing people to the table and asking questions like, what are the critical emerging issues for this particular agriculture and forestry sector in the next 10 to 20 years, you can see, and I can see in the chat, there's lots of questions around climate change, around political stability. We've spoken a lot about trade already. Using Futures Triangle to really think about what are the weights of the past, or even the legacies of our forefathers and foremothers. What are the pushes from the present, and what are the pulls from that preferred future that we see, that we really need to be unpacking and getting lots of different viewpoints, just as the previous speakers have been saying, equally from the farmers or the fisher folk, to the business, to the government, to the private sector. And the one that I always love to make sure we have, at least we recognize the chair is empty if they're not at the table, with what do our youth envisaging for their preferred future. Futures Wheels is another way to just try and unpack some of that. But actually, one of the most fun things that we have done under our agriculture lead, Karen Mapusua, is to develop a Growing the Pacific board game. And this was played actually with the directors of agriculture and forestry from across the Pacific, who, when were first introduced to the notion of playing a game in one of their annual government meetings, were a little bit hesitant. But after getting into one round, which represented 10 years, people really started to own the caricatures that they were playing, whether that be a farmer themselves, whether that be someone from civil society, a young person, a government person, and hopefully, you know, really leaning into their intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and then having to deal with an external shock that comes along. After playing a couple of rounds of this game and having a lot of fun, actually what came out of that has helped shape the current very first agriculture and forestry regional strategy for the Pacific. And that will be launched in its final draft at the Pacific Week of Agriculture in Tonga coming up. So here is where we really managed to lean into futures and foresight as a way to shape a policy that will help us, as Jim said, not just to be prepared for today, but making sure the decisions that we make today are preparing ourselves for the next generation of consumers, of producers, of exporters, of farmers. We've also talked about scenarios, so being able to use narratives and storytelling to really bring your whole self in your own language, leaning into all your ways of knowing and being to create what that transformative or most desirable future scenario is. And then my last example here is around a futures triangle, a preferred future actually for food systems. So not just parts of the food system, not just the agriculture and forestry or the aquaculture or health or statistics, but really bringing all those multiple layers in. And this was an exercise that we did to help us create what that food system vision will be in our own strategic plan. So we have a current state definition. We have the future state definition, which was based on the futures triangle we did and an exercise called causal layered analysis. The image that you can see is one of our fabulous artists who got the metaphor of the fruit basket, the food basket woven together and really brought that metaphor to life with images. And then the pathways, the change pathways that we need to really follow to take us from the current state to the future state. So I guess in reflection, what Futures and Foresight has enabled us to do is to really test our blind spots, test our assumptions, be much more inclusive in how policies are crafted, making sure the voice of people who are really affected by the policies are included and grounding that, but most importantly, really thinking about intergenerational impact and the kinds of legacies that policies create now and what they leave as they are taken over by new policies. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Emily, for sharing the experience with us. So I see that we have received a lot of questions in the chat and we are running late on our schedule. So I wanted to suggest that we will do some Q&As. We will respond to some of the questions and then those who want to stay with us can stay with us for another 5, 7, 10 minutes. But I wanted to take the opportunity before the top of the hour to invite all the participants that are here today to also contribute to the Independent Stakeholders Report for the UN Food Systems Summit +4, which is going to take place in Ethiopia later this year. The Hub has launched a survey and this survey is collecting input from non-state actors to share their perspectives on progress, challenges, and investment opportunities in food systems transformation. My colleague Abigail is sharing the survey there in the chat, so please free to look at that and share with your networks. We would really appreciate that. I also want to take the opportunity to make some advertisement for our next webinar, which will be happening on June 19th, our next Food System Solutions webinar. And the topic there is enabling processes for marginalized voices to drive change in food systems transformation. So you will be receiving invitations and there will be information on the Hub's website about this next webinar and so. I see we're getting close to 3 o'clock Rome time. But so for those who would like to leave us, I want to thank you for joining us today. And for those who still want to join us for another couple of minutes to respond to some questions, ask questions and so on, we are now opening up for some of the questions. And I'm just going to read some questions here that I see in the chat. And then I would kindly ask the speakers, the panelists, to respond to them. So let me see here. There is one question from Hino Samuel Jose. Foresight is good, but however, it's more about what if. But how do we ensure that policy-making judgment is not obscured with too many what ifs? We know the tendency of certain policy leaders being too reliant on precedents, and if that foresight analysis might bring new scenarios that might require policy changes that has no precedent. I'll add one more question here. There's a question from Lorenza, thanking for an excellent webinar. How are the impacts of the food systems on climate change, biodiversity loss, and other planetary boundaries, as well as the feedback loops between food and these systems are integrated in building the alternative futures considered in the Foresight exercise? I'll open up if there is anybody. Lorenzo, perhaps you would like to elaborate a bit on some of the questions. If there's anybody from the panelists that would like to take the floor and respond, feel free and let me know.
There is no silver bullet to address the issue of sustainability of agri-food systems because they are a system, they are a complex system with many elements. So changing technologies, adopting better technologies that move out of conventional agriculture towards other forms of technologies, as Nevena has already mentioned, is a possible way forward. Here at FAO, for instance, we are experiencing, including through Foresight, agroecology as a possible way forward. It's not the only one, but it addresses some issues related to climate change due to the reduced carbon emissions and even some carbon sequestration. Agroforestry, the same, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to make the story too long, but of course, technological changes help in achieving sustainable agri-food systems. We have not to forget that we have to trigger these changes. We have to incentivize these changes. That's why I also put an answer about trade system, to what extent countries that engage in transformation have to be protected from unduly unfair competition from countries who don't adopt the same strict regulations. This is something that we are factoring in our strategic framework at FAO. Over.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo, for sharing that reflection with us. I'm reading out another question that I have received here. It's from Bente Meindertsma from Netherlands Food Partnership, and she has a question about the innovation policy labs. What kind of stakeholders are involved in these labs, and are they open to interested networks and stakeholder groups in the country? Perhaps, Nevena, you would like to expand on that.
Thank you very much.
We cannot hear you.
Yes,
You are muted.
thank you, Bente, for the question. Indeed, in the innovation policy labs, the main idea is to hear the perspective of those stakeholders that are concerned both in formulation but also implementation of particular strategy or policy. And they are very suitable for local solutions, how to remove barriers towards particular policy implementation. And in this sense, non-governmental organization, local stakeholder groups, cooperatives are very welcome. They are even the core stakeholders in the innovation policy lab. So in that sense, there is this big shift of who innovates in policies. It's no longer the government, but actually the more democratic society that proposes the solution that fits to their particular reality. And this is how we accelerate the transformation, because the policy then will achieve this transformative outcome faster and smoother. And I gave you in my response an example in Colombia, where we work on local seed policy where naturally we have a lot of indigenous peoples around the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nevena, for coming in here. And I see that some of the panelists are already putting some answers in the chat, so really appreciated that you are responding directly to the question. I have one more question here directed to Vagenci. Using the rich picture methodology, have you ever experienced difficulties managing participants' personalities and egos? And what strategies or approaches have you followed in order to manage them? Over to you.
That's a great question. It's making me smile a little bit because we haven't come across any artists yet. And so because of that, everybody having to draw a stick figure is a huge equalizer. It's a fantastic equalizer. You have people drawing cattle that look like ants, if you ask me. You have the country being shaped almost like a handkerchief. So I think it ends up being a great exercise. And the fact that nobody is an expert in the drawing when you come to the table is actually the piece that sort of allows people to set their egos aside a little bit. And that way, because you're not necessarily expressing yourself verbally, it also allows those who are a little bit more shy to be able to come and literally come to the table and draw. And as a facilitator, that is something that we encourage everybody to do. I'll give you one example. We had a meeting in Turkana, and in one of the workshops, there was an older gentleman who was sitting down and giving instructions. And I asked him, I said to him, everybody can draw. Even this is your turn to draw. And after a little bit of reluctance, he actually did end up drawing, which was great, instead of giving instructions like he was doing previously. The other thing that I also noticed is that when people draw, they add to what the others have done, as opposed to trying to speak over each other. They point out and then they add. So it also makes for a much better interaction, and it gives people room to express themselves. That's what we found with Rich Pictures. So it's actually one of my favorite tools.
Thank you so much, Vangechi. I see that Jim has raised his hand, so I will hand the floor to Jim for some reflection as well. You are muted.
I mean, just on that one, I think it's a very important and very, very critical question when we're talking about any sort of participatory process. And I think there's a whole range of things you have to be thinking about to make sure that all the different voices and those who are perhaps less empowered are engaging. So some of that can be how you work with single stakeholder groups beforehand. It's making sure who's representing different groups in multi-stakeholder forums. It's got to do with how you build up trust. It's got to do with how you set up workshops. So I think there's a whole menu of what you need to be thinking about to make sure that when you bring different stakeholders together, people aren't being marginalized and the different perspectives and views are being held. And we could probably have a 3-hour seminar just on that topic. But I think a very fundamental question that we all need to keep at the forefront of our minds.
Thank you, Jim, for this addition. Okay, I see now that we are closing. We're 10 minutes past the scheduled time, original time. So I think I've seen that there are some questions that are still not responded to. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move now into the closing of today's webinar. And I want to take the opportunity to really thank all the speakers for your valuable contributions throughout the webinar today. It's been a very rich discussion and a very rich question and answer session as well, even though we didn't have enough time. I hope that the audience that have joined us have learned some new insights and some new tools, and you will be receiving the PowerPoints later so you can dig more into the knowledge that has been shared today. We've heard about why Foresight is important, and we've also heard about how it can accelerate national food systems transformation. And our panelists have shared some concrete examples of initiatives from around the world at different levels and from different countries. As we're about to conclude now, I also want to thank especially the audience that has joined the conversation today. And I would like to remind you again to register for our next webinar, which will be in June on the 19th. And the topic, as I said earlier, will be enabling processes for marginalized voices to drive change in food systems transformation. So with this, on behalf of the Hub, a thank you to everyone. It was a nice chat, and have a really good day, night, evening, wherever you are in the world, and see you next time. Thank you.